Well, welcome everyone. Um, we're glad to have you today. I'm going to introduce Miriam and then let her take over. So Miriam Sagan is the author of more than 30 books, including her newest novel, Shadow of the Minotaur, the book she'll be reading and speaking about today. Not only is she a writer, but she's a teacher. She founded and directed the creative writing program here at Santa Fe Community College and has taught writing workshops across the United States. She graduated from Harvard and has a master's degree in creative writing from Boston University. For those of you who don't know, she also maintains a regular blog that provides art reviews, publishes creative work by herself and other writers, and is a space where she shares inspiration with writers. And if you want to look for it, it's called Miriam's Well. At the end of her presentation, Miriam will take your questions. You'll be able to ask questions at that time using your microphone, or you can put questions in the chat and I will share and read them during the question period. So please help me welcome Miriam Sagan.
Thank you for having me, Valerie. And I'm glad to be here. You'll keep an eye on the waiting room if anybody wants to come in, I think.
Yes, I will let anybody in. Yep.
All right, terrific. So here's what I'm going to do this afternoon, and you all can help me do it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of writing this particular novel and also novel writing in general. I'm going to read some excerpts from it and try to communicate how those were written and the sort of the pattern of thinking about writing a novel, and take questions. I might actually take questions twice. We'll see how it goes, but I think questions change a little bit as we progress in our thinking. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the novel in general. The novel's called Shadow on the Minotaur. It was published, to my great happiness, by Red Mountain Press. Susan Gardner was my editor on it. And it came to me as a series of what ifs. What if there was a young woman who was trapped on a block in Brooklyn and couldn't cross the street? What if she had lost her shadow? What if, and then I come now more into the heart of what is on my mind, what if she was very traumatized? Could she recover? And I've always been very interested, almost to the level of obsession, with the war in Bosnia. I read about it a lot. I checked a lot of movies out from this very library over the years to see how people were dealing with it afterwards creatively. And, you know, I come from a family that was obviously, as a Jewish family, very influenced by the Holocaust, but didn't have a direct relationship to it. And then to experience genocide, essentially, in my lifetime, I think that those things came together for me with an emotional punch. And so my heroine, Taya, has survived the war in Bosnia. She thinks she's okay. She comes to Brooklyn to go to school. There's a lot of backstory. You have to read the novel to get the backstory. But almost immediately, she finds herself in pretty serious trouble. And here was really the first large challenge of the novel. I have not been in a war, and I have not been in Bosnia, right? But however, I was extremely ill and had a near-death experience when I was 21. And in order to understand my heroine, Taya, I decided to give her the same injury to her body that I have. The injury was to my lungs and my shoulder, and I gave it to her. Now, this already sounds a little strange and mysterious. I gave it to her. Is she real, my character? Is she in my mind? Is she beyond me? Is she walking around? I think yes. I think all of those things. She came to life. I created a giant sandbox, a giant playground of history. She felt separate from me in that she seemed to live. And I'll talk about a few other characters that way as well. Where did they come from? But she did not come out of, like some of my characters, out of an old novel that I failed to finish or out of a dream. She existed as a figment of my imagination until she became more dimensional. We see her right at the opening of the book. Taya stepped out of the terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport and took the first cab in line. The driver pitched her medium-sized suitcase and jammed backpack into the trunk. He was Ethiopian, tall and slim with a gold tooth. She gave him the Brooklyn address. A nice neighborhood, he said. It's come up. People from all over the world. Mm-hmm. Lots of different kinds of grocery stores. You like to cook? Yes. Where are you from? In his rear view mirror, he could see a pretty woman in her mid-20s, ash blonde hair, gray eyes, her mouth turned slightly down. You wouldn't have heard of it, she said. Try me. She gave the name of her village, the place she'd left as a child, a hamlet really, with its long line of syllables. He heard the hint of an accent in her voice. Former, he was guessing, former Yugoslavia. Sarajevo? She nodded, but he saw it. You were there in the war? He wanted to talk more now, talk about what he himself knew about war. Every war was different, the flavors, the languages, but in the end, the grief was the same. He listened to the news. He knew what had gone on. 100,000 people dead, just the size of a small city. But if you knew those people, even just one person. Actually, I've come from Paris, she said. She believe she was talking like this to him, but then again, it felt like she had barely spoken to anyone in months. And you're here for cab drivers, concierges, secret police. They could all be unrelenting in their interrogations, Taya thought. I'm going to school. That's good, he nodded. You know, he continued, you can leave a place, try to forget it, but it doesn't always work that way. I know all about that, she snapped. Okay. They drove in silence. And then there's a little description of Brooklyn, and she's trying to do her yoga class breathing. It wasn't working very well, not like it did lying on a mat. Jan used to say that your mind could control your body. He was an idiot in many ways, and certainly he did love to control things, including her. Not himself, of course, his anger, his manipulation, that he left alone, but still, Taya tried it. I'm not frightened, I'm excited, she silently told herself. The only answer was her heart beating fast and loud in her ears. Now that little piece is me. I once had someone tell me to try to do that. It didn't work for me either. Jan is just mentioned in passing, but he's the bad boyfriend, and he will appear later in the book. So she gets out, the cab driver gets into the cab, hesitated, and then leaned to look out at her. She was standing on the cement in the bright light of a late August afternoon. Lady, he said, how did you lose your shadow? Taya glanced down, and indeed, although the suitcase, a spindly tree, and the building itself all cast shadows, she herself did not. I don't know, she said, but the cab was already gone. And then I go into the cab driver's head. And this was a little tricky because the cab driver is not important. We never see him again. But yet a lot of this short novel is about groups of people, and it's almost exclusively about immigrants. And so I felt like the driver needed to speak. In his nostrils, the driver smelled the smoke of cooking fires, the sizzle of oil, heard the slap of his mother's hand hitting the dough shaped and formed to flatbread. His mother's hands, long and slender, tapered fingers, calloused palms, work hands, but soft with the lotion she rubbed in every night. The last time he'd seen those hands, lifeless. He felt his heart constrict, a shooting pain that was in the body, but not of it. He forced himself to look at the little snapshot of his two daughters laughing in pretty puffy summer dresses taken just last month, stuck into the sun visor over the dashboard. His reason to keep going. He wondered what would become of his passenger, so pretty and sad, and obviously in trouble. As he drove towards his next passenger, he forgot all about Taya. So he forgets about her, but we stay with her. She goes into the apartment building, and this is where the hard work began. I had to draw this novel over and over in my notebook. Okay, 4 different apartments in the big apartment building, 4 sides to the block, north, south, east, and west. I've never lived in Brooklyn, but I was born in Manhattan, so cardinal directions mean something to me. I drew it, I labeled it, and in some draft or other, suddenly there's like a laundromat where there should be no laundromat. I had so much trouble. It kept moving. I had trouble stabilizing a very small part of the physical world. Um, but things start to happen. Chaya gets a job. She meets the people in the building. She goes to yoga class. She gets an acupuncturist. And the way I was working it thematically was that people want to help her. They want to heal her. And there's many attempts throughout the novel to heal her. And the big question for me in life and in the book is, can a person get better? And what does that mean? And I'll be reading a little bit more about that, but I wanted to set that scene. Anyway, I have to say, I hate and despise literature where bad things happen to young women. I can't take it anymore. You know what I mean? If you're hitchhiking, I want you to get there safely. And so I didn't want to punish my heroine. She'd already had a really bad time, right? She's had a bad time. She's been injured. And the shadow, we can talk about a little bit more, as a classic mythic way of saying that a person's in trouble. But so I wanted her trouble to be in the past. And, I figured, what did she need? Well, I don't know. She needed a job. She needed a boyfriend. So I got her a boyfriend. I was really happy about that. His name is Josh Lopez. He's a gallery owner on the block. Super nice guy. And she kind of has to go through some explanation before they can take up with each other. He says that he's going to take her out and they're going to go dancing. And she says she can't possibly go because she can't cross the block. So one thing that I'm working with in the novel is zones. And there's a underworld, a subterranean world, and there's a heavenly world, which exists mostly in memory. The subterranean world is an underground club, and it's called Babel. And they go down a manhole and they get there and they have a fun time in Babel. And they're dancing, they're drinking. And then, again, from my own life experience, Taya has to go and use the bathroom. But it turns out that Babel's a pretty confusing place. And so Josh has to kind of give her a little warning before she leaves the area that they're in. Josh, her voice was hushed. What exactly is this? Outside the invisible bubble, she could see the crowd, the band, but she couldn't hear them. And he says, like I said, this place is magic. Thank you for coming with me. He kissed her. They kept dancing. Long minutes, maybe hours passed. Taya felt light and warm. Then eventually she had to pee. I'm going to the bathroom. Okay, he pointed vaguely. That way. And Taya, sometimes if you go out, it's hard to get back in. If we get separated and you can't find me, let's just meet back at the apartment, okay? You have your key? Yes. Taya moved away from Josh, aiming towards a far wall and red neon sign reading ladies. Her ears popped as she left the bubble and re-entered the dance floor. It took her a few minutes. Excuse me. The women's bathroom was chaos. This is the early 90s. Surprisingly large, it had surprisingly few stalls and sinks. A woman was reading tarot cards at a folding table in one corner. 2 women were kissing so intensely, Taya looked away. It was too private. Another woman was snorting coke off a corner of a sink. 1 line, 2. A stall seemed open. Taya didn't see any legs. She went in with relief, but when she reached for the lock, the scene had changed. She was outside. It was daytime. She was in a clearing in a forest where the air was warm, but some snow lingered. She saw a little house in a circle of birch trees. The front door was carved in the shape of a big mushroom and painted red with white spots. A woman opened the door, stepped forward, and looked Taya directly in the eyes for a long moment. The woman was wearing what appeared to be a folk costume with red bodice and long white ruffled skirt. On her head was a crown of flowers and ribbons. Her hair flowed below her shoulders. Her skin was creamy and her eyes piercing. Vasilisa? Taya asked. So you know who I am? The woman laughed in a low alto pitch. Vasilisa the Wise? Of course I know who you are, although I haven't seen you since I was a child, and then not so often. Most people never see me. I've been lucky. Luck has nothing to do with it. I'm only seen when I want to be. Thank you. And we have seen each other more recently than your childhood. We have? How soon they forget, Vasilisa said. Have you forgotten that party right after you and Jan got together? That art school party with too much to drink, with the spirit board calling on me and spelling out advice. And you asked what was in your heart, and I told you that you and Jan would be happy together. Oh, that party, Taya said unenthusiastically. I was pretty hungover, and we weren't happy. Maybe just at the start, but never after that. Yes, I might have been mistaken. Vasilisa did not easily admit to being wrong. Taya nodded. Well, you've come all this distance, so I assume you have a question. What do you want to know? Vasilisa continued briskly. Taya paused. These conversations could be tricky. She didn't want to end up asking something stupid like, why are you actually here? Or am I still in the bathroom? Or why am I seeing a Russian enchantress when I'm not Russian? Will I ever get better? Taya asked. No, said Vasilisa the Wise. Okay, now ask again. Will I ever get better? Yes, said Vasilisa. Which? You decide, said Vasilisa, and then, not unkindly, I think you are already better. But, said Taya, the clearing vanished, the cottage, Vasilisa. There was cracked cement beneath her feet. Off in the distance, it looked like a bombed out city burning. There was a wall, waist high, built of round, smooth white stones, no skulls. It ran along some directional axis she couldn't see from where she stood. This was no genocide with a date and a name, something to horrify the world for a moment before it sank into its vast indifference. Each skull was once a person, each person once a baby, wanted or rejected, fed tenderly or on scraps. This was no bomb or poison gas. Each person was killed face to face, put to the sword by Tamerlane. Hooves shook the earth and you ran, but then you fell. Taya shuddered, but the vision faded, then disappeared. On closer inspection, she saw a large Gothic arcade lit by hundreds of votive candles. Some kind of clash metal was playing. People were dancing beneath the arches. Josh had been right. It was impossible to figure out how to get back. Instead, Taya kept walking, saw an exit sign, followed it, and found herself standing on the doormat of her own apartment. Josh was asleep in bed. The clock read 4:03 a.m. She could only hope it was the same day and year, but everything looked as she had left it, and Josh hadn't turned into an old man or a skeleton or anything. She climbed into bed and fell asleep beside him, too tired to even mull over what had happened. In the morning, their conversation was mundane, as if by mutual agreement. He didn't ask what had happened in the bathroom, and she did not offer to tell. So this is like a sort of natural pause in the book, and I will take a question or two, put them in the chat, and I'll check in a minute if anybody has any sort of initiatory questions, but I will talk a little in the interim. Who is Vasilisa the Wise? And why is she in the bathroom? Vasilisa the Wise is just part of the Baba Yaga series of folktales, and I was raised on that. And she's just a smart, tough girl, and she becomes a smart, tough, adult sorceress. And I saw her when I was writing the book. I was falling asleep. I saw a clearing in the woods. I saw a little house with a mushroom painted on the door. And basically, Vasilisa the Wise said, I'd like to come into your book. So, never one to tell a Russian enchantress no. I brought her in, and she appears 3 times. She appears twice to Vasilisa and once to Jan, who's kind of our villain, to tell him to shape up. It took me a while to understand her motivation until I realized she'd made a mistake. And she'd said they were going to live happily ever after. And they really were not going to. So she has to sort of make it right. There's a lot of magic in the book, a magical realism, and she's I think, the main holder of a certain kind of magic in the book. So let me take a peek in the chat and I'll see what people are asking. Oh, I have a question about trying to get published. And that really ties in to creative process. We think of them as separate, but revision process and pleasing an editor are really one and the same. This book was accepted, and then I had to do a very serious and, for me, difficult rewrite at the start of the pandemic, which was like not a super happy time. I had one very serious reader who also did the copy edit on it, my husband Rich, who I kind of had on tap. And then I had Susan, who was my editor publisher, and both of them felt a little disconnect from my main character. I was like a mother hen with too many chickens. I was working to get this ensemble of people on the block together. I knew that I loved Taya, you know what I mean? She was like super sweet and deserving of happiness in my eye, but she was not fully communicated. Now, I was lucky in that the revision was done in the context of an acceptance. And oftentimes you're doing a revision in the context of rejection, right? Knocking on a door. But you still have to do that revision that adds that level of, suspension of disbelief or psychological realism that makes the novel live outside of you. My professional life has been mostly in the small press, which was where I started off, in Boston as a very young woman, independent publishers. I've been fortunate in that I've had many editors that I've worked with who were exceptional people. Rejection is part of the writer's life. And my main advice is get a strategy, like a fakey strategy. Like, I don't care what people think of me. That might not be true, but it's very helpful. And stick with your strategy. But don't mix up not being able to get published with not being able to complete a piece of work so that it has enough depth and complexity. Also, it's very hard to publish conventionally right now, with an advance and all of that. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I think a lot of my work is not suited to that. It's not commercial enough, and that's okay with me. I'm used to that. Reviews and marketing. I mean, how sometimes people say, they picked it up in the street, they learned to speak a language or to play stickball or pool, something like that. Well, I picked up, guerrilla marketing, how to get reviewed and all of that through trial and error. I started sending my work out when I was 14 or 15, and I'm now, looking at 70 in a couple of years. So that's a long, long time. Again, my advice is the more integrated your professional needs can be with who you actually are, your real community, the better things are going to be. If you can depend on people, trust their opinion, trust their referrals, the way you work, the way you build audience, the way you sell books is going to be natural to you. It's when you're either too self-isolated or too isolated for other reasons, or not really understanding the relationship between your art and your community, that you suffer more. Obviously, we could talk about this for a really long time as to what the specifics are. But I would say when you start off, everything from having a writing group to having people you trust to caring about other people's work is a good place to start. So I hope that was, you know, helpful. Copyright issues. Yes, Jennifer, we will follow up with you and make sure that you have a transcript and the link and all of that. So audience developing comfort, avoiding triggers. You know, I'm gonna talk about triggers. I don't. Can I ask you? Maybe you'd like to unmute. Can you explain what do you mean? Other people's triggers or your own triggers? Well, if you feel like telling me, please do. But I think I would drop below triggers and I would talk about fear. I think when writers start to write and are vulnerable, we fear that we're going to hurt or upset other people. I think it might be a natural concern, but I think you have to trust that you're telling what you believe is true to the best of your ability, and that other people are going to have to do the same. Now, if you're dealing with very violent or very frightening material, you obviously want to know your audience. You don't want to read it in a mixed audience with a lot of small children. For example, I've seen that happen. Or actually, I was once sort of a mayor domo and had somebody ask me, was it okay to read that piece in front of those kids? And we kind of concluded maybe not, just really for the sense of okayness of the writer. It's good to create positive protection for yourself, but when you are writing a first draft, you cannot concern yourself with other people's reactions because there are no other people, right? Are they bringing you lunch? No, you're by yourself. So you're going to have to be raw. That's where your triggers come in, or my triggers come in. You're going to have to be raw. I'm working on something right now that's strangely very difficult for me, and I'll cry when I write it. I couldn't totally stick with my thing of not having anything too bad happen to people. Some very sad things, not historically traumatic, but personally very sad. You're going to have to deal with some grief, and you're going to have to deal with some fear. But so create a nice protective environment for yourself. Bring yourself lunch, and then know your audience. And you may have to accept as a writer that you are exposed, that people may take things a way you didn't intend them to take it. I'll give you an example and then I'll read a little more from this book. When I was young, I wrote for a lot for money. I had a story in Family Circle. Let me just say this story was not from the heart, okay? It was for the cash. And in it was a lady who fell in love with her carpenter and decided to not leave her husband for the cute carpenter. I got a letter from Canada saying, how did you know my story? Why did you write about it? I made the whole thing up, right? So I wrote her back and said, I didn't, thanks for writing, but it's not your story as far as I know, or maybe it's a universal story. We can't control everything that can happen. So I would say focus on authenticity when you're not writing for money, authenticity and privacy. And then you're going to have to use your best judgment. I also have other people read everything. Is this weird? Do I have a blind spot? Am I prejudiced in some way that I don't want to be? I wrote a lot of poems about my daughter when she was a teenager. They were in a book called Map of the Lost, UNM Press. I let her read everything, right? I didn't want to upset her or freak her out. But again, it's based a little bit your personality. Don't be too wussy either. You know what I mean? Writing is essentially the first stage of writing at core is for yourself. I think, this says talks, we could talk about this more later, but worrying about safety. I think that writing is like anything, which is use your resources to protect yourself, whatever that means to you. So actually, these questions of safety, these questions of healing are kind of prominent in the book. And I'm just going to read probably just one more scene. It's probably my favorite scene in the book. And then please think of your questions again, and I'll double check the chat, and also Valerie will help me. Okay, so I have this character. Her name is Stella Rodriguez. She's an academic. She's an anthropologist. And she was in an old book of mine that I could just never get to work. I always loved Dr. Rodriguez because she does something out of the box for somebody else. Now, I said this the first time I read from the book, and I'm going to repeat it. You remember when Jill Biden was criticized for calling herself Dr. Biden? Here we are in community college, if you have a PhD, people call you doctor. Well, I was so happy when I realized that I never called Professor Rodriguez anything other than doctor. And everyone in the book calls her Dr. Rodriguez because they appreciate her presence in the apartment building. Now, I was trained as a massage therapist before I became an academic. And Dr. Rodriguez is an academic who kind of becomes a shaman out of the goodness of her heart. I think any of you, I'm not sure exactly who's here, but any of you who've ever been a classroom teacher will understand this. She's out of the action for about 150 pages because she's grading. And she walks up the stairs to her second floor apartment, constantly carrying, she's just loaded down with a woven basket and a briefcase, and she's just schlepping her grading. And lots of things are happening, and nobody doesn't ever see her really because of the endless grading. However, she gets called away from her grading, and you can see why. I mean, I guess she's sort of me, even though I'm in each character, but objectively, she's a little bit like me. She gets called away from her grading, and she gets asked by the other women in Taya's life if she can help Taya. This is right at the end of the book. They feel that Taya needs to be healed, maybe in a more formal way. And so they're wondering who can they get, how can they do it? And Dr. Rodriguez says she's going to do it. So how's she going to do it? Well, she looks up how curanderos heal, and her great aunt was a curandero who she was influenced by as a child. And her anthropology specialty is what's it like for different kinds of people from different backgrounds to be in medical settings. A fascinating topic, and how do people manage culturally, and what are different cultural attitudes towards recovery. So she's well set up, but she takes a giant leap into the unknown. And so here we are. Their apartments are across from each other. When the appointed time arrived with Dr. Rodriguez, Taya crossed the hallway. As instructed, she was wearing something loose, a cheap but silky caftan from the block store. Surprisingly, as she and the professor were the closest neighbors, she'd never been in the apartment across from hers. When Taya entered the apartment, it was lit by flickering candles and smelled of a small sage bundle used to purify its corners and a handful of copal incense sticks. Some of the candles had been purchased at the nearest bodega and modified a bit with a glue gun so that they were adorned with sequins and little silk roses. It was quiet except for the sounds of the street creeping in through the curtains. The living room hosted a massage table covered in a white sheet. The professor had to borrow that. She greeted Taya with a warm hug and asked her to sit on the couch. You brought eggs? Taya showed her the carton. Good. Well, my dear, this is a sort of informal setting, but I'll try and do things correctly. Can you tell me what you want, what you hope this healing accomplishes? Taya hesitated. This may seem silly, but I'd like to go shop at the Imperial Grocers. That's across the street. And be able to cross the street? Yes. And your shadow? What about it? Do you want it back? Taya hesitated again, this time for longer. She was so sick of talking about her shadow. But if it came back, she could stop worrying about it. Yes, yes, I do. Thank you, she said. Come lie down on the table. Taya did as she was told. The professor murmured a prayer, extemporaneously calling on the Divine Mother and the elements of fire, water, earth, and air which inhabited everything, even the streets of Brooklyn. Her hands hovered over Taya, and she took a little broom made of lavender and sage and began sweeping Taya's body, starting with the feet and moving upward. The professor kept an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe securely fixed in her own inner eye so she wouldn't be distracted by the clutter of astral objects flying off of Taya: skulls, high heels, dumplings, fruit pits, a pistol, ripped books, a skinny cat, and more. Are you doing okay? She asked. Yes, Taya said, but a bit faintly. Do you need some water? Yes, thanks. Taya sat up briefly and drank. The professor kept sweeping. Then she took an egg and began to do the same motion with it that she had done with the little broom, moving it up and down Taya's body. Then, holy fuck, the professor yelped as the egg grew warm, then hot in her hands and burst into flames. She dropped it, feeling sure her fingers were singed, but they weren't. What in the, said Taya. The room smelled of burnt feathers and scrambled eggs. I feel like I'm going to pass out, the professor said. Sit on the couch, Taya ordered. Put your head between your legs. The professor complied. I'm less dizzy. Thanks, she said. The two women sat side by side. What happened? The egg just burst into flames. I bet it burnt the carpet. The professor looked wildly around, but they both saw nothing beneath the massage table, not even a smear of ash. The egg had vanished into thin air. I've never seen anything like that ever, said Dr. Rodriguez. In all your years of being a curandera? Taya teased her. The professor smiled. You know I'm not the real thing. Well, you're some kind of real thing, Taya said. On her way out, she kissed the professor's warm cheek. Stay hydrated, Taya, the professor called after her, then closed the door and began to blow out the candles. So I did not realize until after the book was published and I was reading aloud from it that it's the first time in the book that Taya tries to take care of somebody else directly. She's helped people before, but her concern where she says, put your head between your knees, where she's acting like the healer, that there's been a transfer of energy. And it seems in the book like Dr. Rodriguez's healing session almost does 100% of the trick. And then there's one more piece that has to happen. So I'm going to take a look at some questions. How has the pandemic impacted your writing and process? And what do you like to read for pleasure? Great question. It was a little eerie to be trying to finish a book about somebody who couldn't go out during the pandemic. I think it might have been helpful or a little bit like a missing ingredient, because I feel that final revision was the complete revision. And there was a lot in the book about managing, like what does it mean to not be able to leave the block? And of course, a lot of the pandemic at the start, on a practical level, if you weren't dealing with directly being sick, was about managing isolation. Other than that, it always takes me a while to respond to my life story. And so I haven't been writing about the pandemic hugely or directly. I mean, some poems, and I have a feeling that it's coming into the next book, if that makes sense. There's a pandemic, surprise, surprise, in the next book, although the book opens after it. It's about people who refuse to come out of isolation, a little kind of off the grid commune in central New Mexico where they decide to stay away from the outside world. Kind of thought-provoking for me, at least right at this point in time. You know, what I like to read for pleasure is pretty much anything. I had a dear friend who was a librarian who did not like my use of the word trash reading, by which I meant, she said, you mean genre? And of course she was right. I like I like to read genre. I like to be transported. I'm reading 12 French novels right now, not all at once. Famous, hard to read French novels. And you can't stick with that, every minute of the day. So my son-in-law keeps me supplied with science fiction and fantasy. And I love to read nonfiction for pleasure too. Um, right now I'm reading Weaving Sweetgrass, and which I think probably everybody's read but me. And I'm reading about the origins of the universe. It's like reading is maybe more than pleasure for me. It's more like survival. Like just a day without reading is almost like not brushing my teeth. I don't feel right. I can really make a plug for a library and for books. Thank you for the question. Um, and Valerie, have I missed some questions? Is there anything on the top that I ought to take a look at?
There is a question up here. Let's see, wanting to know about your writing process, how it's different writing a novel versus poetry. Do you work on a schedule? Do you work in a certain place all the time? Do you write in the same genre or different genres simultaneously? That kind of thing.
Okay, fun. It's fun. I'll do my best on that one. Probably most entertainingly, I feel like I have no place to write. I have a 100 square foot studio that my brother built me 30 years ago in my backyard. When my daughter went to college, I commandeered her room. I'm in a small house, but out of the 5 or 6 rooms, 2 of them are mine. I have access to a studio out on 14. I used to have an office at SFCC, and I constantly feel I have no place to write. And when I really want to write, and this is embarrassing, but I'll tell you, I'll check myself into a cheap motel for a couple days. And when I'm there, I was down at the end of Cerritos off and on the last 4 or 5 months. I always think I have no place to write. So apparently I need a gigantic universe, and I like to move around. But I can write, I can write on a road trip. Um, I learned to write with interruption when I was a young mom. And I do, you know what? I also think I'm very restless in my genres. I'm mostly a poet. I'm primarily a poet. I always write. Do I have a notebook around here? Oh, it's holding up my computer. I won't show you. I keep a journal. I keep diaries. I keep outlines. I have notebooks for each thing. I work in longhand. I work on the computer, and I swap genres. If I was just writing fiction, I would be very unhappy. Fiction is not my strong point. This is my third published novel. I have an unpublished novel. It's a good novel. I hope it gets published. I'm working on a novel, and I have about 3 trashed out, never to be seen, thank goodness, novels. Now that sounds like fun, but it's not enough fun to live on. There's not enough completion. I I was well trained as a poet. Okay, I have very, very good teachers. And I taught myself to write memoir because it's not that different than keeping a diary. Also, I wrote personal essays for years for Sage Magazine at the Albuquerque Journal, and that trained me. But I never wrote fiction professionally, except for that one story for Family Circle. And so I had to teach myself, and it was a slow, labor intensive process. So, again, what's your takeaway? Be a nice friend to yourself. And when you say, I have no place to write, a good friend doesn't say, yes, you do, don't be a hog. A friend says, gee, would you like to, maybe you'd like to apply to a writer's residency and go away somewhere and you'll feel better. Some of it's about just feeding that slightly insane part of the writer's mind. Um, Valerie, am I on?
Yeah, one of the questions has to do with something I'm interested in, a question about playing with ambiguity. Um, let's see, do you play with clarity and ambiguity? I was especially interested in this in the first part that you read. You mentioned that the character was wrong in their prediction of the future. And I'm just so curious how you left that in, why you didn't correct the character. Was the character um, speaking to you and you didn't feel like you could change? If you could talk a little bit about that, and then your do you write with clarity or ambiguity?
Um, Thank you. That's great. The character who's wrong is, of course, somebody we think should be right. She's supernatural. She's an enchantress. But one of the things I've read for pleasure is enormous chunks of Terry Pratchett and of Neil Gaiman, who work with supernatural characters in the mundane world, archetypes and mythological characters from every possible world. Something like Neil Gaiman's American Gods, which is also about immigration, but immigration of the divine. And it's a wonderful book that I love. People make mistakes even when they're gods, right? And so I didn't really think Vasilisa the Wise would show up, in New York, just like for fun. I needed to give her motivation. Now, she should be omniscient. She should be perfect. So her need to correct her mistake is much greater than my need to correct my, like if I make a mistake, which is common enough, I just say, I'm so sorry I made a mistake, not, oh, this shakes me to the core because I don't think of myself, I'm a Russian enchantress and I can't make a mistake. So when I realized that I put that in very late in the writing. I figured she had to have motivation. Otherwise, why is she being so helpful, right? One of the pieces of feedback that I got, negative feedback, was that people were too helpful. Now, people have tried to kill my heroine, and they've committed genocide, and they're full of terrible hatred. And so I'm trying to even out my worlds. But I had one character say, well, people in New York are helpful because they're kind of Budinsky. They want to know about you. They're curious. It's not just altruism, right? And even, Dr. Rodriguez gets talked into it to do her friends a favor. They're basically, only you can help us. You're smart. You're an anthropologist. And so we all know that motivation. You don't want to let your friends down, and you're kind of tickled that you've been asked. It's not that you're saintly, that you're going to help. So I think that, slightly less than perfect motivation is a great way to roll. Clarity and ambiguity are not really opposites. Ambiguity in life means things are confusing. Ambiguity as a literary term means they have more than one meaning. So things shouldn't be confusing in your short story or even your poem, but they should have more than one meaning, right? They should have levels that the reader can access: conscious, unconscious, archetypical, personal. And so I think that, clarity is softened by ambiguity. I mean, I don't know the answer to the question that Chaya asked in the bathroom. I don't know the answer. Can I get better? And I cheated. I cut off with when she can cross the street, right? What if she marries this dude? And what if she has some kids? And what if one of those kids gets really sick? Is she going to flip out? I don't know. But luckily, I don't have to know, because I thought I'd end on that note. But I think we know from our own experience that things don't stay put. They change and they transmute. So I just wanted to keep asking that question and sort of go for a temporary happy feeling around it. It's funny because I don't like to cook. I don't do the grocery shopping. And in this book, Chaya is an incredible baker. And she's also had some problems with, near starvation. And she's a little bit of a hoarder. And on the block, there's this horrible little food mart, like a horrible convenience store where everything is gross. And across the street, there's this fabulous grocery store, maybe, 5 times better than Tallinn. You're the greatest, and Trader Joe's and the Co-op, everything like it's a majestic grocery store, and she can't get to it, right? Because she can't cross the street. So again, why do we want to get better? to save humankind or to get ourselves some really nice produce. I mean, we don't really know what we're going to do with ourselves. So I hope that helps. Um, I think maybe time for one more. Valerie, you wanna knock me one or?
Sure, let me look here. There was a question about your process. Do you outline, how do you prepare, I guess, to write?
It's a good question, and it's kind of can lead into some conclusions as well. Basically, people are divided on this. Okay, so this is not advice. This is more like a personal thing. I have to know where I'm going, because how do I know how people are going to act until I know what's going to happen? I mean, it's like, is she going to get her shadow back? That's a pretty different opening for me. Yes, you could open with that and she could not get it back. But the tonality, the flavor, I mean, the cab driver has survived something, right? He's seen something bad. He's come to New York. He's got these little girls. I mean, as I say, I was born in New York. I love cab drivers, and he cares. He cares about other people, and he cares about survival. If she's not going to survive, I need a different cab driver. I need a cab driver who's despondent or crazy, or who won't pick her up. Does this make sense? It's like the theme is built through the detail, and that's how I'm working it. So this book was outlined, and as I said, mostly it was physicality was a problem. This block is made up. You'd think I would feel relaxed. No, I was not that great of a creator god. I kept making, also, did I swap out my directions a little bit, and the apartment building, the layout, the open floor layout of the apartment was a little wrong. Then I have to give me an underworld. And so there's a lot of pre-writing, a lot of descriptive writing that didn't come in, a lot of sort of juggling. I'll tell you one more thing. The club, Babel, is from another book of mine. It's in my second novel, which is called Black Rainbow. It's set in the 1968, late 60s. And in it is a huge ziggurat on the Lower East Side of New York. And it's called Babylon, and the people who go in come out transformed. And I thought maybe that club didn't go away, even if the club is just in my mind. And so I put the club in here, changed the name, and something like that is grounding. It's ambiguous because it's changed. It's a joke that not many people are going to get. I'm the only one really who's going to get it. But it allows for ambiguity because an imaginary place is changing, and therefore it has levels of meaning. Is it a dark place? When Taya comes out of it and she sees, I had seen a photograph once of the skulls of people who Tamerlane, who's medieval, had killed. Is it a dark place? Is it a super fun place, which it appears to be at the beginning? Are all places a little dark and a little super fun? The bathroom was also something that I entertained myself with because, if you were ever in a bad club bathroom in the 1980s or 90s in New York City, a place that you were like, I don't think I can actually go into this bathroom so much as it's so overly exciting. And then it also falls away, right? It's a portal. And so I think that that sort of takes me through my thinking. When you outline, when you condense it to 3 sentences, when you pre-write, when you journal, to me, that's like the ancient invocation to the muse. When somebody like Homer or Virgil starts a big epic poem, they don't say, give me money or give me lunch. They say, lady, muse, come down to me, inspire me, so that this kind of the work that is not the direct work is to me an invocation. It's an invocation to the imagination and to those forces that help us when we're writing. So I think that's my conclusion. Um, Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, everybody,
Thank
for
you.
coming. You can find me on my blog. And
Do you want to mention
sounds.
the workshop you're doing in May?
Thank you. Yes, and tell me
You're
if I've
welcome.
got everything right. It's
Sure.
May the 4th.
Yes.
It's 6 to 8, and it's a haiku workshop, maybe with a little bit of chanka and senryu. It's sort of about flash poetry as a stress antidote. We'll be looking at some traditional haiku forms, but really the emphasis is on what I would call the New Mexican haiku. How can we now, in the here and now, write very short poems that give homage to the ancient Japanese, but that are of us and that have spontaneity and liveliness? Now, the way to register is to send me an email. That's Sagan, MSAGAN 1035 at AOL.com. But if you don't have it, all this information is on the library's website. So you can
And
just find it.
I just posted your email address in the chat, so anybody can cut and paste it from there. And space is limited, so if you're interested, make sure you email today. Well, thank you so much. This has been so special, and I really appreciate your peek inside the writing process and how a person grounds themselves as a writer within a fictional world and a fictional process. So interesting, and um, I could just keep listening to you all afternoon. So thank you so much for sharing this. And
All right.
I look forward to your May workshop as well. So, and thank you all for coming today.
Thank you. Nice to work with you. Take good care.
You too.